Now I would like to invite Dr. Luka Trebežnik, who is a research associate at Scientific Research, Science and Research Center Koper. That's at the seaside, at the Slovenian seaside. But he's also a professor at the Faculty of Humanistic Studies of the Alma Mater Europea here in Ljubljana.
Thank you, Andrei, for especially for putting everything together. We can all agree that the organization is highly above the standard that we are used to. So, and thank you also for all the colleagues for the discussions and the really pleasant company. I'll talk about really the element of the sacred, how, and mainly how it relates to community and our common existence. When we set out to think about the communal dimensions of existence, we are faced with the question of the relationship between same and other, and thus also with the question of communication and violence, and ultimately even with the sacred as a radical opening up of otherness and sacrifice as the violent production of the sacred. So we are immediately faced with a whole series of oppositions, most obviously between us and not us, inside and outside, and so on. Until recently, things were more or less clear. On the one hand, we have identity, and on the other, difference. But lately, it is becoming increasingly obvious to us that these two modes can no longer be simply separated. Identity reveals itself to us more and more as a fiction, as something that is deeply divided and split within itself. How is it even possible to think if identity and difference are not in opposition to each other? In one of the key texts for the modern understanding of the question of community, Jean-Luc Nancy says that we have not even begun to discover what it means to be in common. Nancy questions the conditions and possibilities of the community or being in common, and thus presents a very penetrating analysis of modern interpersonality. The basic idea of his philosophy is that being itself is communal. Being is in common. Every otherness is subsequent. We always share a common sense of being, and sense itself is a sharing of being. To explain this a bit, I will refer to the title term in the name of our event. I understand the trace as a indeterminacy of meaning and elusiveness as something that is not and cannot be present in the strict sense. So I try to understand the trace in the enigmatic sense of Levinas's description as a past that was never present. It is therefore a kind of almost mystical element, but one that is too general to be truly such. So the trace is that which defies definition as a presence, nor is it a mere absence. It is quite possible that it is the most important modern philosophical concept that can enable us to overcome some of the dichotomies that have proved inadequate over the past century. Community, then, is an articulation of the trace, for the trace shows that no autos is possible without an inscription of alterity, no inside without a relation to an outside, which cannot be simply outside but must remark itself on the inside. The idea of trace is a conception of something that can never be closed in on itself, but is always already shared, which leads us directly to the notion of community, of shared existence as a privileged form of access to sense and truth. This means that we have to reverse the established ontological schemes a little, which of course almost always assume the primacy of the self, the being, or the subject. This reversal can be illustrated by Nancy's distinction between meaning on the one hand and sense on the other. This distinction marks the fundamental fact of exchange with the world as sharing and being shared. On the one hand, communication can be understood as a mere giving, as the transmission of information, linguistic fact. In this sense, Nancy speaks of meaning, so la signification, but on the other hand, there is a much more fundamental dimension of communication as community building, which arises from a much more primordial fact of our shared life together. Here he speaks of sense, le sens, which appears as a communication which can be extra-linguistic also. This can include a vast variety of gestures, for example, a smile. Being is sense that is turned its own circulation, and we are this circulation, wrote Nancy. Community is therefore a communication that cannot be shared. In his early reflections on this topic, Nancy referred to the community as désœuvrement, a term he borrowed from Blanchot and which can be translated into English in various ways. I found unworking, inactive, idle, inoperative, unproductive community. So with this expression, Nancy wants to say that community is not only the negation of work, but also of any productivity, purposefulness, or teleology. It has no goal and no direction, and thus goes beyond and away from the classical notions of community, which were somehow always based on the idea of work and productivity. For him, community is essentially something that belongs to, emerges from, and returns to the experience of finitude. The old notions of community were based on the projection of a total presence. Sometimes this presence was based on common soil, nation, blood, language, and so on. And Nancy calls these constructs metaphysics of immanence, metaphysics of destinations or goal. But by this, of course, he also means large communitarian projects that were structured as a path to social progress and prosperity. The concept of community was characterized by the idea of total presence, an absolute immanence of man to man. This means that it is based on absolute clarity, unity, and receptivity. The individuals in the community thus become the same to one another. They share a common identity. This sharing, partage, is another important concept for Nancy. Being is being shared, he says. But contrary to traditional notions, for him this sharing works both ways. The singular plural being means both sharing and being shared. Whenever a sense arises, it is already in the process of sharing. An unshared sense has no sense. The sense is therefore always already plural. With this conception, which inscribes the split of identity into the center of togetherness, Nancy attempts to divert from the idea of community of immanence. If the immanence of the community were ever actually achieved, it would not be the success of the community, its completion, but its dissolution and its end. Therefore, Nancy's community, based on the ontological foundation of original being with, is conceived as a community without fusion, a community without communion. Nancy says, the true community of mortal beings, or death as community, is their impossible communion. Communion, for Nancy, primarily means the ideal of a deepest level of sharing, which for some even creates an otherworldly bond. The ecclesial communion of the living and the dead is well known. The community has no fixed bonds, but is rather fragile and open. A community without communion means, of course, that it has no sacramental character. But here, however, Nancy departs considerably from his most important point of reference for his thinking about community, Georges Bataille, who locates the origin of community precisely in the proximity of the sacred. For Nancy, the inoperativity of community lies precisely in the fact that it produces nothing that could be sacrificed. Whereas for Bataille, sacrifice, so the violent production of the sacred, is a gesture from which community emerges. In many ways, Nancy's ontology of the common stands in contrast to the idea of radical alterity, of otherness as a completely transcendent reality, as described very well by Levinas, with the concept of the completely asymmetrical character of the relation to the other. This Levinasian conception of the other, the primacy of the ethical mode, consequently means that community is characterized by an always deferred approach to otherness, and as such it remains ultimately impossible. Nancy can thus speak of a negative community, a community of writing, a community as impossible, a community without communion. The question of community has always been linked to the concept of the sacred. Even for Nancy and his interlocutors, community is conceived as a form of sacred communication, quite unlike Émile Durkheim, the sacred as collective effervescence, as he called it, and other representatives of the French anthropological school, including René Girard and others. The sacred, for them, the sacred represents the self-representation of the community, its self-renewing character. In this view, the sacred is only an expression of the community itself, its cohesive dimension. Bataille, on the other hand, is completely imbued with the awareness of the impossible character of sense, which is always characterized by indeterminacy. A community can only be based on a heterologous character, on a sense that always transcends, and if this sense is established, then community dies. The question of the sacred brings us also back to the core of our problem, namely the relationship between the same and the other, with all the connotations of big other, which often have a theological character. For example, in psychoanalytic theory, community can only come about through sacrifice, the joint consummation of death, and in this act, both the victim and the sacrificer must die. This is Bataille's quite outrageous theory. So the community is formed on the basis of both sacrificer and victim dying in the act of sacrifice. This violent intrusion of otherness, which tradition understands as a production of the sacred, so Satzer Fazere, in this respect, sacred violence is the way in which community is produced and elevated. The other, which ultimately means the death of the other, makes community as communion impossible. If the relation of man with man ceases to be that of the same with the same, but rather introduces the other as irreducible, and given the equality between them, always in a situation of dissymmetry in relation to the one looking at that other, then a completely different relationship imposes itself and imposes another form of society, which one would hardly dare call a community. Or else one accepts the idea of naming it thus, while asking oneself what is at stake in the concept of a community, and whether the community, no matter if it has existed or not, does not in the end always posit the absence of community. These were the words of Maurice Blanchot. Blanchot here talks about Bataille and his impossible community that is by necessity exposed to a community of absence or absence of community. It is an unshared experience of solitude, a speech that cannot be captured and expressed in words. It is a meaning that is always already lost. It has no use, creates no work, and does not glorify itself in that loss. Thus, the gift of speech, a gift of pure loss that cannot make sure of ever being received by the other, even though the other is the only one to make possible, if not speech, then at least the supplication to speak, which carries with it the risk of being rejected or lost or not received. So communication is structured as impossible, since it exists in this split between the same and the other. On the one hand, then we have the non-prioritization of otherness, which leads to the disintegration of community. For Nancy, there is no doubt that community is precisely the coincidence of otherness and sameness. Community is the point at which sameness and otherness share their identity. Community is thus an attempt to answer the question of the relationship between those two opposites, same and the other. The question of identity. Is then community a relationship to the other, and thus ultimately always an impossible community, since otherness could be then normalized, or is it a relationship to the same? If it seems that Blanchot and Levinas, as well as Derrida and some others, for example, say the former, so this could be also called some maybe Hebraic moment of or Hebraic element, then Nancy and Bataille lean much more to the other side. So, and although Nancy persistently wanted to preserve alterity, he wanted to avoid any mystification of otherness and community. For him, community is the primary fact of our existence, and any otherness or even sameness, for the matter of fact, is of a secondary nature. In contrast to Levinas, for him the face, so for Nancy also the face is secondary and a construct. So he says, I can, on the contrary, grasp the relation with the face only as secondary and as constituted. As a solution to this dilemma, again between the same and other, Nancy introduces the concept of sharing, partage. This sharing is what we are, he says. The question arises how life, existence can be shared and divided at the same time. For Nancy, this is a way of being outside of oneself. And here we can again see how much this idea fits into Bataille's ecstatic thinking. For Bataille, however, this ontological fact of the impossibility of communion is even more important, as it gives rise to the whole dimension of the sacred. Sacrifice as a violent staging of the sacred, which is at the same time a central communal fact, an impossible attempt at communion, is only possible on the basis of sameness. It is not enough to sacrifice the other as other. Bataille recognizes this truth in the various pre-Columbian American sacrificial rites, which, like all sacrifices, were based precisely on the figure of substitution, which presupposes a certain identity. When Aztecs, for example, sacrificed prisoners of war, they had to make sure that they looked at least a little like them. They also used makeup and costumes for this purpose. This is how it is in the theater. The logic of the community is therefore the logic of supplementarity. The fact that the other is easily replaceable dominates the Western history of sacrifice. We can never sacrifice the other, it does not work. The same must be sacrificed, and this can only be achieved through the figure of substitution, which is the basis of sacrifice. This chain of substitutions ends with the realization that sacrifice at the final analysis is impossible. Sense cannot be forced. It is a sacred consciousness that truth is constituted as common, as shared, divided, and always already split in itself. Bataille understood sacrifice, the communion of the sacrificer and the sacrified, sacrificer and the sacrified or the victim, as a pure derivation of the communal logic of sameness. For him, it was a pure excess that is consummated and completed at the threshold of death. At the same time, the question of the future of community remains to be open, since to be alive means to have a future. The closure of this futurity, the reduction of the other to the same, can only mean death as in the sacrificial staging of the sacred. Bataille has attempted to contrast the suffocating everyday life of utilitarian logic or philosophy, or we could even say common sense, spontaneous philosophy of modern men. He tried to contrast this with sacred components of community. But even violent gestures cannot tear us away from the constitutive lack of sense. But this condemnation is not necessarily perceived as bad news, but rather as a fact of freedom and the future. The absence of community is not the failure of community. Absence belongs to community as its extreme moment or as the ordeal that exposes it to its necessary disappearance, again wrote Maurice Blanchot. Thus, the community remains a mystery and a failed attempt to share this mystery. For the mystery is dissolved by sharing. The sacred can never become a truth or an object. There is nothing to possess. And it is precisely this sharing of this impossible task and this elusive meaning that is community. Community and the sacred must remain elusive, uncertain in their essence, evading their questions. Thank you for your time and your attention.
Thank you very much for your lecture, and I open the floor to questions, discussions, comments. Oh, there are. I think it was Christian first. Yeah.
So, looking on the last word of your title, the sacred, I recall the title of Levinas, Du sacré au saint, from the sacred to the holy.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you can comment on this, because Levinas, if I remember well, for him the sacred is the moment of paganism, of idolatry, and then that moment of paganism, of existential absorption into enjoyment, into elemental, is split by the separation, is the moment of atheism, and then comes the religion, the relation to the other, and that is the switch to the holy. And can you integrate this third element in your approach? Because maybe it can show a different light.
Yeah. Thank you. I had this in mind already, but if I would prolong it, probably it could be well to a bit comment it a bit. Yeah, and it is really, and we can agree with even Levinas's description. This Bataillean approach can be, in some regards, even regarded as a pre-Christian, pre-Jewish, but. It's really the aspect of this spiritualization or maybe rationalization of sacrifice that is running through the whole history of West. Yeah? You see, it's really the substitution. The Akeda is substitution of Isaac with Ram and so on. Yeah? It's really goes on, and then it becomes just a breath, yeah, at the end, or even nothing, yeah, at the pure end. So it's really for Levinas, this moment of Akeda is really the end of human sacrifice. It's really it's elevation of the moment of sacrifice. So yeah, this holy here wouldn't make that much sense looked that way, because Bataille really tries to steer away from this becoming nothing of the sacrifice, because this leads to also, there's no community anymore, since the sacred is so normalized, so stabilized, so, it becomes sterile in a way, it becomes worthless. And for him, really, it's, I can understand why he wouldn't be satisfied with this logic of, the constant humanization, we could call it, of process, or symbolization would also be a good word. Yeah, it's really getting more and more symbolized. But yeah, I try to focus on this chain, yeah, which is really going on, the supplementarity. Yeah? It's always just the logic of the replacement, which is also here maybe more on work in these later stages of sacrifice, but the things for Bataille don't work anymore, because the value is reduced. So the child firstborn, so on, he's the worthiest that we can give. Yeah? So therefore, this input of economical in the sacrifice can also have to be regarded. It's clear to me that Levinas was trying to really spiritualize these all aspects of this ritual and steer away from them. So therefore he used this concept of holy. Yeah, sure, and it works that way. Didn't answer directly when all around it, but yeah, at least partially, I hope.
Thank you. I learned a lot because I'm not familiar with Nancy, but I was wondering about one of the distinctions you made, which is very important in philosophy in general, so distinction between meaning and sense. I was wondering, can you elaborate more? Because you said that meaning is associated with what some words, sentences say, and sense is that, for example, that I'm laughing. I don't.
Connection. not I'm laughing, but a smile, that we share a smile, or you see a smile. So it's really, I try to also connect to two levels of communication. Yeah, so it's really the one, just a transfer of information, the meeting of the meeting of signifier and signified. Just really even the significatory act and so on. Yeah? It just a pure transfer, which I can maybe even highly actualize. Yeah, this AI can do also. Yeah, this part, even better than us. Transfer information, share, and so on. Then this another part of, I would call it community forming. Really, when we bond, in a way, this can be also extra linguistic. This can be, that I mentioned a smile, some or a wave or something like this. It's really anything can be this. Yeah? So even extra linguistic gestures and so on. So yeah, this is sense, and this is probably the things that the machines still cannot do. To connect on this level, let's hope at least, or make it a wager. But yeah, don't know if I make it a bit more clear. But yeah, it's really. To me, a really useful opposition to even think about like this, what is still remaining for humans. So it's this community forming part of communication, probably. So it's really this, useful that it's same root word, but it's really the how this sort of miracle, how we can, form or realize this common existence and so on. Yeah? So it's not through some words or some, direct meaning or signification. So yeah, it's as much as I can explain. Yeah, but maybe it will come something more. Yeah, but at least an attempt for now.
Thank you very much for the lecture and the questions.